In human beings, every single one of our somatic cells in our body contains 46 individual chromosomes. Now remember, in humans and other diploid organisms, organisms that have a chromosome number of 2n, each chromosome in our somatic pair contains a homologous chromosome. So since humans contain 46 individual chromosomes, that means we have 23 pairs of homologous chromosomes. Now, out of these 23 homologous pairs, 22 pairs are known as autosomal chromosomes, and the other pair, the final pair of chromosomes, is known as the sex chromosome pair. Now, in this lecture, we're going to focus on the sex chromosomes. Now, the first major difference between autosomal chromosomes and sex chromosomes is the following. In autosomal chromosome pairs, the two homologous chromosomes are always the same size and shape. But in the case of sex chromosomes, in females, the two sex chromosomes are the same size and shape, but in males, we have one large sex chromosome and one small sex chromosome. So that means we have two homologous chromosomes that are not the same shape and not the same size. So to see what we mean by that, let's take a look at the following three diagrams. So we have diagram A, diagram B, and diagram C. Now, in diagram A, we have an autosomal chromosome pair. So we have this autosome chromosome number 1 and its homologous autosome chromosome number 2. So one of these came from the male parent and the other one came from the female parent. And notice in this pair, these two autosomal chromosomes are the same size and the same shape, and they carry the genes that code for the same exact types of traits. So we have this gene that codes for, let's say, the hair color, and this gene also codes for the hair color, and these are known as alleles. Now let's move on to diagram B and diagram C. In these two diagrams, we discuss the sex chromosome pair. Now in females, as I mentioned earlier, we have two individual homologous sex chromosomes that are the same exact size and the same exact shape, and they carry genes that code for similar traits. And these traits, as we'll see in just a moment, are known as sex-linked traits or X-linked traits. And the reason we call them X-linked traits is because this chromosome is known as the X chromosome. So in female individuals, both of these sex chromosomes are said to be X chromosomes. So in female individuals, in female humans, there are two X chromosomes that are identical in size and shape and carry genes that code for specific sex-linked traits. Now, what about C? Well, in C, we describe the situation in male individuals. In males, unlike in females, we only have one X chromosome, and the other sex chromosome is called the Y chromosome. And notice, it's much smaller in size and has a slightly different shape than the X chromosome. So in contrast, male individuals have one X chromosome that contains many different types of genes that code for specific sex-linked traits, and it also contains a small Y chromosome that basically has one or several genes that code for maleness. Why is that? Well, it's because the Y chromosome actually determines what the gender of that particular individual is. So to see what we mean, let's take a look at the following diagram. So let's suppose we begin inside the male individual, and the male individual begins to produce sex cells, the gametes, known as sperm cells. So this is the precursor sperm cell, and because we're dealing with a male individual, that means the sex chromosome pair will consist of an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Now, before meiosis takes place, during interphase, we have to replicate each one of these sex chromosomes. So the X chromosome is replicated, and so is the Y chromosome replicated. So this is our cell that contains the replicated sex chromosomes. So we have two identical X chromosomes and two identical Y chromosomes. Now, to form our sperm cells, the gametes, in this particular male individual, meiosis has to take place. And when meiosis takes place, first, these two segregate, and then these two individual chromosomes segregate. At the end, we produce 4 different possibilities. Now, 2 of these sperm cells have identical X sex chromosomes. The other 2 have identical Y sex chromosomes. So that means 2 of the 4 sperm cells, or 50% of the sperm cells, have the X chromosome, and the other 50%, 2 out of 4, have the Y chromosome. So basically we have a 50% chance of producing a sperm cell that is carrying the X sex chromosome, and a 50% chance of producing a sperm cell that is carrying the Y sex chromosome. Now, in contrast, if we take a look at this gamete formation process as it takes place in females, because females always carry this pair of sex chromosomes, so we have X chromosomes in both cases, the only type of X cell that a female can produce is an X cell that carries the X chromosome. It can never contain a Y chromosome. So female individuals always produce X cells that have X chromosomes. So how do we actually form a male individual, and how do we actually form a female individual? Well, to form a female individual, we have to have a sperm cell that carries the X sex chromosome. So we have the sperm cell that is carrying the X chromosome, and it combines with the X cell, and the X cell always carries that X sex chromosome. When they combine, they form a zygote that contains 2 X chromosomes, and so this will basically be a female. Likewise, to form a male, we have to have the sperm cell that is carrying the Y chromosome, as shown here, combined with the X cell. So this is our X cell that is also carrying that X chromosome, as in this case, because once again, the X cell always carries the X chromosome. And so when they combine, we now have this X chromosome and the Y chromosome in the zygote. And so eventually this zygote will develop into a male individual. So we see that because there is a 50% chance of forming a sperm cell that is carrying the X chromosome, so we have 0.5 chance of that taking place. And we have 100% chance of the X cell forming the X chromosome, so that is equivalent to 1.0. We multiply these two and we see that there is a 0.5 or a 50% chance of forming the female individual. And likewise, we can use the same exact mathematics in this particular case. So 50% chance of the sperm cell carrying the Y chromosome, 0.5 multiplied by 1.0, and that gives a 0.5 chance, or 50%. So we see that forming a female and a male are equally likely events. So this is 50% chance, and this is 50% chance. Now earlier when I introduced the X chromosome, I said that the X chromosome contains many genes that are involved in expressing proteins that basically are important in not only the female individual but also the male individual. So the X chromosome contains many genes that are necessary for both genders, and that's exactly why both of these individuals, the female and the male, contain X chromosome. In the case of the female, we have 2. In the case of the male, we have 1. So we have at least 1 X chromosome in each one of these cases, and that's because it's the X chromosome that carries those necessary genes that are needed for both genders. Now, in contrast, if we look at the Y-chromosome only usually has one or several genes that are involved for giving that male their maleness. Now, whenever we're looking at genes on the X chromosome, those genes on the X chromosome are known as sex-linked genes or X-linked genes, and that's because these are the genes that express proteins that are necessary for the different types of traits that exist in males as well as females. So let's take a look at the female and then let's take a look at the male. So we know that in the female, the two types of sex chromosomes are the X chromosome and the X chromosome. Now we know that a gene can either be dominant or a gene can be recessive. Now, if the gene is dominant, we usually describe the gene with an uppercase letter. If the gene is recessive, we usually describe it with a lowercase letter. Now, what are the different possibilities of a female? Well, a female can be either homozygous dominant, and this is the case when we have, let's say, an uppercase B and an uppercase B gene. So what's one example of a gene that is found on the X chromosome? Well, our gene that basically codes for color blindness. So an uppercase B basically means the individual will not be colorblind. And in this particular case, if we let's suppose that the brown gene shown here is the gene that codes for color blindness, uppercase B means that's the dominant gene and the individual will not be colorblind. And so because both of these are uppercase B's, we have homozygous dominant. Now, likewise, we can also be homozygous recessive. And in this particular case, we have lowercase b, and in this particular case, the individual will be colorblind because we have two recessive genes. Now, we can also be heterozygous, and that means one of them could be uppercase B, the other one can be lowercase b. In this particular case, the individual, the female individual, will not be colorblind because the dominant basically inhibits the expression of that recessive gene. Now, in the case of male, the only thing that we can have is hemizygous. And what hemizygous means is we only have one gene and not a pair of genes. So in this case, we have a pair of alleles, but in this case, we do not have a pair of alleles because our male only contains one X. And it's the X chromosome that carries those sex-linked genes. So if our individual is uppercase B, that means they won't be colorblind, but if they're lowercase b, they will be colorblind. And this type of scenario is called hemizygous. Hemizygous means we only have one of the X chromosomes and not two, and so we only have one of these sex-linked genes and not two as we have in the female case. Now, the last thing that I'd like to briefly talk about is the inactivation of the X chromosome in female individuals. So it turns out that in female individuals, in female somatic cells, one of the X chromosomes is actually inactivated, and we produce this structure known as the bar body. So in female somatic cells, one of the X chromosomes is typically inactivated by transforming that active X chromosome into an inactive X chromosome we call the bar body. Now, which one of the two sex X chromosomes are transformed into the bar body is random. And what that means is it's random which one of these will transform into the X body. So in about 50% of the somatic cells, this chromosome is transformed into the bar body and becomes inactive, but in the other 50% of the somatic cells, it's this chromosome that is transformed into the bar body.